Hello. I want to take a couple minutes and talk about separation of church and state issues with regard to the First Amendment rights that are in the Bill of Rights, and talk about some recent Supreme Court cases in the last half century or so that relate to the question of the application of the concept of separation of church and state. First of all, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, added shortly after the Constitution was ratified, says that the government of the United States may not establish a religion, and they may not prohibit the free exercise of religion by United States citizens. As you know, the Bill of Rights, and therefore the First Amendment, was designed originally to restrict the government of the United States, to keep the government of the United States from being able to exercise certain powers, and to protect the rights of the people from the government of the United States. And so this is very specifically what the First Amendment says the government of the United States cannot do. It cannot establish a religion, and it cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. Now, the 14th Amendment, which was passed in the 1860s, added to the United States Constitution in the 1860s after the Civil War, was designed to protect the rights of freed slaves at that time in our history. And it actually says that any citizen of the United States is guaranteed all of the privileges and immunities of a citizen of the United States wherever they live. And essentially what that did was that flipped the Bill of Rights. And it actually made the government of the United States the protector of the people's rights, rather than being limited by the Bill of Rights. They became the protector of the Bill of Rights, and they began to consider themselves the protector of the Bill of Rights, or the protector of rights against, say, states and local communities, which was exactly the opposite of what the Bill of Rights was originally intended to do. It originally, in its original form, had nothing to do with protecting the government of the United States, protecting us from states or local governments. So to kind of see how that's worked its way out in the last 50 years or so, I want to talk briefly about two Supreme Court cases. The first is the Engel versus Vitale case. In this case, there was a law in the state of New York that in public schools they had a prayer that the children recited at the beginning of the day. And what happened was an atheist family sued the school and said that that was unconstitutional, that for their child to attend a school where there was prayer held each day was actually a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, that was government establishing religion. Now, obviously, that's not the federal government establishing religion. The public school in New York would function under state law, but nonetheless, she made that argument, and according to the 14th Amendment, you could make that argument that this was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the Supreme Court of the United States looked at that and said, yes, they agreed that it was a violation of the Establishment Clause, and essentially they made it illegal to have organized prayer in school. And as you know, that's been in effect, that ruling's been in effect for many, many years now. The second court case has to do with religious displays. And the case that I have highlighted here, or I've written here, is the McCreary County case that occurred in Kentucky, in which a local county had posted the Ten Commandments. And this is a religious display. And the question is whether that is, again, an establishment of religion. And so what happened there was a lawsuit was brought, and the Supreme Court looked at the question, is this an establishment of religion? And they said yes, that having a single religious display on government property, now remember, this is local government, not federal government. Local government property is actually a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So they said that religious display had to be taken out. in a related case, very close to the time McCreary County was decided, that occurred in Texas, the Supreme Court looked at the religious displays on local courthouse lawns in Texas that had like 10 or 12 different religions as part of the display. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's okay. That's okay to have a religious display on public property, on government property that has many religions represented, but it's not okay to have one where there's only one religion represented, because that would violate the Establishment Clause. So very interestingly, to kind of bring this together, because of the new interpretation of the First Amendment as a result of the 14th Amendment, and this flip in rules of the United States government, what the United States government has said to us is that in our local communities, in our local school districts, we are not permitted to have organized prayer, because that would violate a person's right, or that would actually be a violation of the Establishment Clause. That would be local communities or local governments or state governments establishing religion. And they've also said that you can't put the Ten Commandments or a nativity scene up at Christmas time, because that violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Interestingly, though, the federal government itself, what are their practices with regard to religion? Well, we know that the president, when he is inaugurated, puts his hand on a Bible and takes his oath of office. The United States Senate has a chaplain who opens each session with prayer and who is available to the members of the Senate for counseling and encouragement and spiritual guidance. Our money says on it, the government's money, the money the federal government prints, says, "In God we trust." And so it's a very interesting situation that we have now, is that the government of the United States seems to not be following certain guidelines with regard to the First Amendment. But on the other hand, the government of the United States is forcing states and local communities to follow a very, very strict guideline or interpretation of the First Amendment. So it's a very important understanding to have with regard to separation of church and state and the principles that are here. And I would just say one other thing: when you think about a school and the fact that you can't pray in school, the foundation of that argument is that schools are therefore our government, and therefore, because they have public money and they use public money, they are essentially government entities, and therefore any organized prayer is an establishment of religion by a government entity. But that raises another question. Are schools really government? Is anything that takes tax money government? And I always say, well, if schools are government, then maybe grandma's government too, because a lot of our grandmas take Social Security checks. And if that's the case, is she not allowed to pray at our family gatherings? And that's kind of a humorous example, but what about hospitals? Hospitals, are they government agencies? Because they take federal funding. You know, in a hospital, you can request a chaplain to come and pray with you and encourage you before you're going into surgery or whatever, and that's available in our hospitals. And so it's interesting. Is a school a government agency just because they take government money, tax money, to function? Because if that's the case, then we have all kinds of things that are really technically under that description, government. So separation of church and state. You have the First Amendment. You have what it was originally intended to do, to create a separation between the church and the state, which was actually very, very limited what it was intended to do in the first place. And then you have the 14th Amendment, which changed the role of the government of the United States in that conversation. And then what it actually caused is the prohibition of school prayer by local school districts, and not permitting local communities to post religious displays unless they had a whole bunch of displays of many, many different religions there. So that's just a brief overview of the concept of separation of church and state in American government.